The moment the binding light touched my wrist, I understood there was no going back. I did not choose this. My family chose it, the council chose it, the treaty chose it. All I had to do was stand still and let the golden thread wrap around my hand while a stranger from a small, loud, short-lived species stood across from me, waiting to become my husband. His name was Marcus Reyes. I had seen his file only once, and even then, most of it was blacked out. A soldier, a survivor of something called a border incident, a man given to me not because anyone thought I deserved happiness, but because my house needed to prove loyalty to the new alliance between the Sithari Dominion and the people of Earth. I stood in the ceremonial hall of Threnvos Station, feeling every eye in the room on me. My mother sat stiff and proud in the front row, her fingers laced together so tightly her knuckles had gone pale under her blue skin. My father did not attend. He had made his opinion about this marriage clear enough without needing to say a word in person. The war priests stood in a half-circle behind the altar, their robes trailing long shadows across the polished floor. They were the ones who frightened me most, though I did not understand why at the time. Sithari war priests did not usually attend common bindings. They came for battles, for funerals, for moments the Dominion considered sacred or dangerous. I remember thinking, even then, that a wedding between a noble daughter and a human soldier should not have required their presence. Marcus did not look like what I expected. I had built an image in my mind of a rough, loud creature, the kind of human soldier the news channels loved to show tearing through enemy lines with reckless joy. Instead, the man standing across from me was quiet. His shoulders were tense, not with pride, but with something closer to discomfort. He kept glancing at the priests behind him, the same way a man glances at a door he is not allowed to walk through. When the officiant asked him to speak his vow, his voice was steady, but low, almost apologetic. I promise to protect this alliance, and to protect her, for as long as I am able. Simple words. No poetry, no declarations of love, because there was no love to declare. This was duty, dressed in ceremonial robes and golden thread. I spoke my own vow in the old Sithari tongue, the words rehearsed so many times in my chambers that they came out of me without feeling, like a song I had memorized but never understood. I promised loyalty, I promised alliance. I did not promise anything close to affection, and neither did he ask for it. When the golden thread finally sealed itself around both our wrists, forming the mark that would announce our union to every scanner and register in Dominion space, I felt nothing but cold. I turned to look at him properly for the first time since the ceremony began. His eyes were a shade of brown I had never seen among my own people, warm in color but distant in expression, like a man standing at the edge of a memory he refused to enter. He offered me the smallest of nods, an acknowledgement, not a smile. That was when I noticed it. The war priests were not watching me. They were watching him, not with the reverence they gave to war heroes, and not with the polite curiosity Sithari usually reserved for humans, our newest and strangest allies. They watched him the way a handler watches a caged predator during feeding time. Careful, measured, waiting. I told myself I was imagining things. Nerves before a marriage will do that to a person, even one who did not choose this union out of love. The banquet after the ceremony was a performance in itself. Nobles from 3 neighboring houses attended, all eager to see the human my family had been given, all whispering behind painted fans about how strange it was that a species barely a century into space travel had been folded so quickly into the highest levels of alliance politics. I sat beside Marcus at the head table, both of us dressed in ceremonial cloth heavy enough to make movement difficult. He ate very little. He answered questions from curious nobles with short, polite sentences, never volunteering more than necessary. When Lady Ferris Dorn, a woman known across 3 star systems for her sharp tongue, asked him directly what made humans worth including in the Dominion's protection, he paused before answering. "We showed up when it mattered," he said. "That is all I can really speak to." It was not arrogance in his voice. If anything, it sounded like something closer to sorrow, buried under practiced calm. I studied him throughout the banquet, the way I might study an unfamiliar species in a report, searching for the traits that would explain why my family had agreed to this. Humans, according to every briefing I had read, were considered useful but unrefined, quick to adapt, quick to fight, quick to lose their lives, but lacking the discipline and honor codes that shaped Sithari warriors across 1,000 years of tradition. They were, by most accounts, a convenient tool, numerous, easy to deploy in large numbers against enemies, too costly for Sithari lives. Yet nothing about Marcus matched that description. He did not boast. He did not seek favor from the nobles clearly eager to associate with anyone connected to the new alliance. He barely looked at the honor he had apparently earned by marrying into a noble house. If anything, he seemed like a man enduring an obligation rather than accepting a reward. Halfway through the banquet, one of the younger nobles, a boy no older than 20 cycles, asked Marcus if it was true that humans had fought and won battles against enemies far larger than themselves. Marcus's jaw tightened before he answered. "Sometimes winning just means fewer people you love get hurt than the day before," he said. "It is not something worth celebrating the way your songs make it sound." The table went quiet after that. Even Lady Ferris, who always had something clever to say, said nothing. I found myself watching him more closely after that exchange, not out of duty, but out of something closer to curiosity. There was a weight behind his words that did not belong to a simple foot soldier handed a political marriage as a reward. It belonged to someone who had already paid a price much older than this ceremony. Later that evening, after the guests had gone and the golden lights of the banquet hall dimmed into their resting mode, Marcus and I were finally alone in the private quarters assigned to us. It was the first time since the ceremony that no one else was watching. He stood near the window that looked out over the docking bays, his back to me, hands loosely clasped behind him. I remained near the door, unsure of the customs that governed this strange new arrangement between our species. "You do not have to stand there like a guest in your own home," he said without turning around. "I am not going to bite." It was an attempt at humor, awkward and dry, but an attempt nonetheless. I allowed myself the smallest curve of my lips, though I doubted he could see it from where he stood. "I am simply uncertain what is expected of me now," I admitted. "This marriage was arranged for reasons that have very little to do with either of us as individuals." He finally turned to face me, and for a moment, something flickered behind his eyes, something tired and old, though his face carried none of the years that should have accompanied such weariness. "I know," he said. "Believe me, I know exactly what this is. I am not here because anyone thinks I deserve a noble wife. I am here because the people who arranged this needed a human close enough to your family to keep everyone comfortable with the new alliance." His honesty surprised me. Sithari nobles rarely spoke so plainly about the mechanics of arranged unions, even when everyone understood the truth behind them. "Then we are in agreement," I said. "This is duty, not affection." "Agreed," he said, though something in his voice made the word sound heavier than it should have. I asked him then, perhaps foolishly, why the war priests had watched him so closely during the ceremony. His expression shifted only slightly, but enough for me to notice a change beneath the calm surface he wore like armor. "They always do that," he said simply. "It is nothing you need to worry about." It was clearly a deflection, but I did not press further that night. There would be time, I told myself, to understand the strange tension surrounding my new husband. For now, exhaustion from the long ceremony pulled at both of us, and neither seemed inclined to explore the depths of a marriage neither of us had asked for. Before retiring to opposite ends of the shared quarters, he paused near the doorway separating our rooms and looked back at me. "For what it is worth," he said, "I will keep my vow. Whatever this marriage is supposed to be, I will not let harm come to you if I can help it." I did not know, in that moment, how heavy a promise that would eventually prove to be, or how much of himself he might one day be forced to reveal in order to keep it. I only knew, as I lay awake that night in unfamiliar quarters aboard a station humming with the quiet machinery of an alliance built on convenience and shared fear, that something about my new husband did not fit the description given to me in any briefing, any file, or any whispered rumor among the nobles who had attended our wedding. Duty had brought us together. I had no reason yet to expect anything more. But somewhere deep in my mind, a small, persistent thought refused to fade, the memory of those war priests watching him not as a curiosity, but as something they were relieved to finally have contained. I did not understand yet what that meant. I would, before long, understand it more completely than I ever wished to. For now, I closed my eyes in a marriage built entirely on obligation, unaware that the quiet, apologetic man sleeping in the next room carried something within him that even my own people, with all their ancient wisdom and old songs of war, did not fully know how to name. Duty had given me a husband. I did not yet know what duty had truly given me. The first thing I learned about living beside a human was that he rose before the station's morning cycle even began, long before the artificial light along the corridors brightened from dim blue to working white. I would wake to find his side of our shared quarters already empty, his boots gone, his small bag of gear missing from its place near the door. At first, I assumed this was simply human habit, a soldier's discipline carried over from a life of duty. It took only a few days for me to notice something stranger. Marcus did not simply wake early. He avoided sleep as if it were an enemy waiting to ambush him the moment his guard dropped. I found him one night standing alone in the narrow observation corridor near our quarters, staring out at the slow drift of stars beyond the station's hull. It was well past the hour most of the crew had retired, and the corridor lights had dimmed to their lowest setting. "You should be resting," I said, more out of habit than genuine concern. He did not turn immediately. "Could not sleep," he said. "Some nights are like that." I studied his profile in the dim light, noting the tightness in his jaw, the way his hands rested on the railing as though bracing against something only he could feel. "Is it the marriage that troubles you?" I asked. "If this arrangement causes you distress, I would understand." He shook his head slowly. "It is not you," he said. "It has never been you." He did not explain further, and I did not press. In the weeks that followed, I began paying closer attention to the rhythms of his days, partly out of the curiosity my mother always warned would get me into trouble, and partly because something about the mystery surrounding him refused to leave my thoughts alone. Marcus spent most mornings in the maintenance bay, working alongside a rotating crew of technicians on small repair tasks that seemed far beneath a soldier of his supposed rank. He never complained about the work. If anything, he seemed to prefer it, hands busy with wires and panels rather than idle in the quiet spaces where his thoughts might wander. In the afternoons he trained, not with the Sithari warriors who occupied the station's main combat hall, but alone, in a smaller room set aside for what the humans called physical conditioning. I watched once from the doorway, careful not to be noticed, as he moved through a sequence of exercises with mechanical precision, his breathing controlled, his expression distant, as though his mind had traveled somewhere far from the room his body occupied. In the evenings he wrote letters, actual letters, composed on an old data pad that looked worn from years of use, addressed to names I did not recognize. Family, I assumed, though he never spoke of them, and I never asked. It was during the second week of our marriage that I first noticed the way other human soldiers treated him. I had assumed, given his quiet nature and lack of any obvious rank insignia beyond the basics, that Marcus held a fairly ordinary position within the human military contingent stationed aboard Threnvos. That assumption did not survive contact with reality for very long. I observed it first in the mess hall, a wide chamber shared by both Sithari crew and the human delegation assigned to the station. Marcus entered quietly, as he always did, carrying his tray toward an empty table near the back wall. Conversations around him did not stop entirely, but they softened, the way voices soften when something uncomfortable enters a room that everyone would rather ignore. A young human soldier, barely more than a boy by the standards of his own species, offered Marcus a seat at his table out of what appeared to be simple politeness. An older soldier beside him, a woman with graying hair named Ellen Marsh, placed a hand on the boy's arm and gave a small shake of her head. The boy's offer died in his throat, and Marcus, without any visible reaction, continued to the empty table alone. I asked one of the station's junior officers, a Sithari communications specialist named Raynar Ost, whether this treatment was common among the human crew. Raynar hesitated before answering, clearly uncomfortable with the question. "They respect him," Raynar said carefully. "Respect and comfort are not always the same thing." I pressed for more, but Raynar excused himself quickly, citing duties elsewhere on the station. It was not the last time I would encounter that particular kind of evasion when Marcus's name came up in conversation. Determined to understand the truth behind my husband's strange standing among his own people, I made use of the resources available to a noble daughter of my house. My family maintained a modest network of information gatherers across several stations, useful for keeping track of political developments relevant to our interests. I requested a full review of Marcus Reyes's service record. What came back was less a record than a series of gaps. Basic training, standard. Assignment to a border patrol unit, standard. Then, 3 years before our marriage, a single entry marked with a classification level higher than anything my family's network had ever encountered attached to a human file. Incident designation, Cassandra Line. Everything beyond that single line had been sealed by an authority even my father's connections could not identify. I brought this discovery to Marcus one evening, perhaps unwisely, perhaps out of a growing need to understand the man I had been bound to. We sat together in our quarters, a rare evening when neither of us had immediate duties pulling us elsewhere. I asked him directly about Cassandra Line. His reaction told me more than any words could have. His hands, which had been steady moments before, went still against the table's surface. His eyes, usually warm despite their distant quality, went flat and empty for the briefest moment, like a light switching off behind them. "Where did you hear that name?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. I explained about my family's information network, watching his expression carefully as I spoke. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring at nothing in particular. "That is not something I can talk about," he finally said. "Not because I do not trust you. Because some things are better left where they are." I wanted to press further, but something in his voice, a rawness beneath the calm, convinced me this was not the moment. I let the subject rest, though the mystery only grew heavier in my mind with each passing day. The incident that finally forced the truth closer to the surface happened during what should have been an unremarkable emergency drill. Threnvo Station conducted regular safety exercises, simulating everything from hull breaches to reactor failures, ensuring that both Sithari and human crew remained prepared for genuine emergencies. I had grown accustomed to the routine blaring of alarms during these drills, the practiced calm with which crew members moved to their designated stations. This particular drill simulated a hull breach in the station's lower decks, an exercise that required emergency response teams from both species to coordinate a simulated rescue operation. Marcus, as part of the human contingent's standard rotation, was assigned to one such team. I happened to be present in the observation deck above the drill zone, having accompanied a delegation of Sithari officials curious to witness joint species cooperation in practice. From my vantage point, I watched the drill unfold with mild interest, until the moment the alarm's pitch suddenly changed. It was a small variation, almost imperceptible to anyone not trained to notice such details. The station's systems had registered an actual anomaly during the simulated drill, a minor power fluctuation in one of the lower deck systems, nothing dangerous, but enough to trigger a brief shift in the alarm's tone before the automated systems corrected the error. I watched Marcus in that single moment when the alarm's pitch changed. His entire body went still, the kind of stillness that does not belong to rest, but to something coiled and waiting. His eyes, from my distance, appeared to lose all warmth, all distance, all trace of the quiet, apologetic man I had grown accustomed to sharing quarters with. For that single heartbeat, he looked like something else entirely, something that had been carefully folded away and was now, for the briefest moment, unfolding. Then the automated systems corrected the fluctuation, the alarm returned to its proper drill tone, and Marcus blinked, his shoulders relaxing, his expression returning to its usual careful calm as though nothing had happened at all. No one else on the observation deck seemed to have noticed. The Sithari officials continued their conversation about resource allocation for future joint drills, entirely unaware of what I had just witnessed. I found Raynar Ost again later that day, more insistent this time in my questioning. I described what I had seen during the drill, watching the young officer's expression shift from polite evasion to something closer to genuine unease. "You should ask the war priests," Raynar finally said, his voice lowered, despite the empty corridor around us. "They know more about him than anyone else on this station, more than his own commanders, if the rumors carry any truth." I asked why the war priests, of all people, would hold such knowledge about a single human soldier. Raynar's answer chilled me in a way I had not expected. "Because they were the ones who requested him for this alliance specifically," he said. "Not the human delegation, not your family's house. The war priests asked for him by name, before your marriage was ever arranged. Some say they have been watching him since the day he first arrived in Dominion space." The implications of this revelation settled over me slowly, like cold water finding its way beneath layers of ceremonial cloth. I had assumed, as most nobles assumed, that my marriage to Marcus served the simple political purpose of demonstrating alliance solidarity, one house among many, offering a daughter to smooth relations with a new and useful species. But if the war priests themselves had specifically requested this particular human, watched him with the wary attention I had witnessed during our wedding, and continued monitoring him through channels even my family's considerable resources could not fully penetrate, then the marriage was never truly about alliance solidarity at all. It was about proximity, about placing someone loyal to a respected house close enough to observe him at all times, someone who would notice if whatever the war priests feared ever began to surface. I returned to our quarters that evening with more questions than I had carried in weeks, uncertain whether to confront Marcus directly or continue my quiet observation, gathering pieces of a picture I was only beginning to understand. I found him already there, seated near the window, his datapad open before him though he did not appear to be writing. He looked up as I entered, and something in my expression must have betrayed the weight of what I had learned that day, because his own expression shifted immediately to something guarded. "You look troubled," he said carefully. I considered lying, offering some excuse about political matters unrelated to him, but something about the quiet man before me, carrying whatever burden he carried, with such careful, practiced calm, made dishonesty feel like a betrayal neither of us deserved. "I know the war priests requested you specifically," I said, "before our marriage was ever arranged. I know they have been watching you since before you arrived in Dominion space." His face went through several expressions in quick succession: surprise, something close to resignation, and finally, a tired acceptance that seemed to settle over him like a familiar weight he had simply been waiting to have acknowledged. "I suppose it was only a matter of time," he said quietly. "You are more observant than most people give you credit for." I asked him, as gently as I could manage, what exactly the war priests were watching for. He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes drifting toward the window and the slow drift of stars beyond it, the same view he had stared into during that first sleepless night. I had found him standing alone in the corridor. "There is a version of me," he finally said, "that I try very hard to keep folded away. Most days, I manage it well enough that even I can almost forget it exists." I asked what would happen if he could no longer keep it folded away. His answer came slowly, each word chosen with obvious care, as though speaking the truth aloud carried its own kind of danger. "Then you would understand exactly why the war priests watched me the way they did during our wedding," he said. "And I am not entirely certain you would still want to be standing beside me when that happens." I did not know, in that quiet moment aboard Threnvo Station, how soon I would learn the full truth of his words, or how completely my understanding of duty, marriage, and the man I had been bound to would be rewritten by what was still to come. For now, I only knew that the mystery surrounding my husband had grown too large to remain hidden much longer, and that somewhere beyond the edges of the alliance we both served, something was already moving that would force whatever Marcus kept folded away out into the light. whether either of us was ready for it or not. The alarm that woke me was not a drill. I knew it the instant my eyes opened, because the pitch was wrong, sharper, more urgent, carrying none of the practiced rhythm of a training exercise. Marcus was already awake beside me, already moving, pulling on his gear with the fast, economical motions of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. "What is happening?" I asked, my voice still thick with sleep. "The choir has crossed the outer border," he said. "Real this time, not a drill." The name struck fear into me, the way it struck fear into every soul across Dominion space. The choir was not a nation, not an empire, not even a single species in the way most understood the term. It was a hive-swarm collective, thousands upon thousands of small, coordinated bodies moving as a single mind, consuming resources, territory and lives with the same mechanical patience a tide shows the shore. The alliance between the Sithari Dominion and Earth had been built specifically to hold the border against them, though until this moment I had only understood that purpose in the abstract, distant way one understands a danger that has always belonged to someone else's part of the sky. I dressed quickly, following Marcus out into corridors already alive with the controlled chaos of a station preparing for genuine conflict. Sithari soldiers moved in formation toward the combat hall, their war priests walking among them, chanting low prayers meant to steady nerves before battle. Human soldiers moved with a different rhythm entirely, faster, less ceremonial, focused entirely on reaching their assigned positions with minimal wasted motion. I lost sight of Marcus somewhere near the junction leading to the human command deck, swept along by a crowd of officials being directed toward the station's safest interior chambers. I should have gone with them. Protocol demanded it. Instead, I found myself pushing against the current, driven by a need to understand what was truly happening, a need that had only grown stronger since the night I confronted Marcus about the war priests watching him. The command deck, when I finally reached it, was a storm of activity. Screens along every wall displayed feeds from sensor arrays positioned along the border, showing swarms of small vessels pouring through a breach in the defensive line like insects escaping a broken nest. The numbers scrolling beside the feeds were staggering, far beyond anything the station's forces could hope to hold against directly. Counselor Renar Ost, no longer the quiet junior officer I had questioned in empty corridors, stood near the central display, his face pale beneath his blue skin, relaying orders to teams scattered across the station. "The outer settlements will fall within hours if reinforcements do not arrive," he said to a gathered group of officers. "Threnvos itself will be within striking range before the next full cycle." I found a quiet corner near the edge of the command deck, largely unnoticed in the chaos, and watched as the situation continued to unfold. Sithari war doctrine, built around formation discipline and honor-bound engagement rules refined over centuries, struggled visibly against an enemy that recognized no such rules at all. The choir did not fight with strategy in the way the Dominion understood strategy. It fought with overwhelming numbers, each small unit expendable, each loss meaningless to a mind that measured victory only in territory consumed and resources absorbed. I watched 3 separate Sithari formations attempt textbook defensive maneuvers against the swarm's leading edge, each maneuver breaking apart under the sheer weight of numbers thrown against it. The war priests among the ranks chanted prayers meant to invoke ancient battle spirits, prayers that had steadied Sithari hearts for 1,000 years of conflict against enemies who understood honor, who respected the old ways of war. The choir understood none of it. It simply consumed. It was during the 3rd hour of the battle, as the situation on the display screens grew increasingly desperate, that I heard Marcus's name spoken among the human command staff for the first time since the fighting began. Colonel Daniel Ashworth, the senior human officer aboard Threnvos, stood near the central display with an expression I had not seen him wear before, something between reluctance and grim necessity. "We need to deploy Reyes," he said quietly to the Sithari officers gathered beside him. The reaction among the Sithari present was immediate and unmistakable. Several of the war priests present exchanged glances heavy with meaning. An older priest, a woman I recognized from our wedding ceremony, stepped forward, her expression carefully neutral, though her voice carried an edge I had not heard from her before. "Are you certain that is necessary?" she asked Colonel Ashworth. "Once deployed, containing him again grows more difficult with each use." Colonel Ashworth's jaw tightened. "The outer settlements have 12,000 civilians, who will not survive the next 6 hours without intervention," he said. "I do not have another option that gets them out alive." I stepped forward before I fully understood my own intention, drawn by a need to know exactly what they were discussing, exactly what containing him meant, and why my own husband's name had become the center of such careful, fearful deliberation. Counselor Raynar noticed me first, his expression shifting to alarm. "Lady Velthara, this is not a place for you right now," he said, moving to guide me away from the central display. I resisted his guidance, my eyes fixed on Colonel Ashworth. "What are you asking my husband to do?" I demanded. The colonel studied me for a long moment before answering, as though weighing how much truth I could bear in that moment. "What he does when there is no other choice," he finally said. What he was trained to do before any of us understood what that training would eventually cost him. Before I could press further, an alarm along the command deck's communication array signaled an incoming transmission. Colonel Ashworth turned to answer it, and I caught only fragments of the exchange, enough to understand that the outer settlements were requesting immediate evacuation support, that the situation had grown too desperate for standard response protocols, and that time had run out for deliberation. I found Marcus near the drop pod bay perhaps 20 minutes later, having pushed my way through crowded corridors with a determination that surprised even myself. He stood alone, dressed in gear I did not recognize, dark and unadorned, nothing like the ceremonial uniform he had worn during our wedding, or the practical fatigues I had grown accustomed to seeing him wear during ordinary station duties. He turned when he heard my approach, and something in his expression, a mixture of resignation and quiet sorrow, told me he had known I would find him before he departed. "You should not be here," he said gently. "I need to understand what is happening," I said. "I need to understand what they are asking you to do." He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes drifting toward the drop pod behind him, its systems already cycling through pre-launch preparation sequences. "There is a part of me I have spent 3 years trying to keep buried," he said finally. "The war priests know about it. Colonel Ashworth knows about it. Today, 12,000 people on the outer settlements need something buried too deep for ordinary soldiers to provide." I asked him directly what that part of him was. His answer came slowly, each word weighted with a tiredness that seemed to reach back further than the years his human body could account for. "Before the Alliance existed, before your people and mine had ever met, my unit encountered something during the Cassandra Line incident," he said. "Something that changed what my body could do, changed it in ways the doctors who examined me afterwards still do not fully understand. I do not use it because I want to. I use it because sometimes there is no other way to keep the people I care about alive." I wanted to ask more, wanted to understand the full shape of whatever transformation he was describing, but the drop pod behind him chimed with a signal indicating final preparations had completed, and I understood our time for conversation had run out. He stepped toward the pod, then paused, turning back to face me one final time. "You should go somewhere safe," he said, his voice softer than I had ever heard it. "I do not want you to see this part of me." Before I could respond, before I could tell him that I intended to see exactly what he was, exactly what my marriage had truly bound me to, the pod's door sealed shut around him, and the launch sequence began its final countdown. I did not go somewhere safe. I made my way instead to the station's observation deck overlooking the battle zone, driven by a need I could not fully explain even to myself, a need to witness whatever truth Marcus had spent 3 years trying to keep hidden from the world, and perhaps from himself as well. The observation deck was crowded with officials and off-duty crew, all watching the unfolding battle through reinforced viewports and live sensor feeds projected across the chamber's far wall. I pushed my way toward an open space near the viewport, ignoring the surprised glances from nobles who recognized me as the wife of the human soldier whose name had begun circulating through hushed conversation across the deck. The battle below had reached a critical point. Sithari formations, already stretched thin against the swarm's relentless numbers, had begun a coordinated retreat toward the outer settlement's evacuation zone, buying time for civilian transports to escape while the swarm's leading edge continued its slow, inevitable advance. Then the drop pod carrying Marcus struck the planet's surface, and everything changed. I watched through the sensor feed as he emerged from the pod's wreckage, alone, facing a swarm numbering in the thousands, with no visible support beyond whatever the pod had carried with him. For a moment, nothing seemed different. He simply stood there, gathering himself, the way any soldier might before engaging an overwhelming force. Then something shifted. I do not have adequate words to describe what I witnessed next, even now, with the benefit of time to consider it. The swarm's forward units, which had continued their relentless mechanical advance against every other obstacle placed before them throughout the battle, suddenly hesitated. Their coordinated movement, the eerie unified rhythm that made the choir so terrifying to face in open conflict, faltered, breaking into confused, scattered patterns. Marcus moved forward into the hesitating swarm, and the sensor feed, despite its clinical distance, could not entirely strip the moment of its strange, terrible weight. He moved with a calm that did not belong to fear or fury, but to something that felt closer to sorrow, as though every action he took carried the weight of a memory he wished he did not need to revisit. Around me on the observation deck, I heard Sithari officials murmuring in hushed, frightened tones, using an old word from Dominion scripture that I had only ever encountered in ancient religious texts, a word reserved for entities that existed beyond ordinary mortal categories of hero or warrior, entities the old scriptures described as walking judgment given temporary form. I turned to the noble standing beside me, an elderly woman whose hands trembled as she watched the feed. "What is that word?" I asked her. "Why are people calling him that?" She looked at me with an expression caught somewhere between awe and genuine fear. "Because the old scriptures warned that such beings walk among mortals only when the ending of something has already been decided," she said, "and because once summoned, even the being itself cannot always promise it will remember how to become ordinary again." I turned back to the feed, watching as the swarm's confused scattering gave way to something closer to open panic. Thousands of small coordinated bodies breaking formation entirely, fleeing from a single figure standing amid the wreckage of a drop pod on a planet's surface far below. I did not fully understand, in that moment, exactly what Marcus had become, or what price such a transformation demanded of the quiet, apologetic man who had spoken his wedding vows with such careful humility only weeks before. I understood only that whatever the war priests had feared, whatever Colonel Ashworth had reluctantly authorized, whatever Marcus himself had spent 3 years trying to keep folded away, was now fully unfolded upon the battlefield below, and that nothing about my understanding of my husband, my marriage, or the alliance that had bound us together would ever be the same again. The battle was far from over, but something had already changed, something far larger than the outcome of a single engagement against an overwhelming enemy. I had come to the observation deck seeking understanding. What I found instead was the beginning of a truth so large it would reshape everything I believed about duty, about marriage, and about the man I had been given not out of love, but out of an alliance's desperate practical need. Whatever Marcus truly was, I intended to see it through to its end, no matter what that understanding might eventually cost me. The swarm below did not simply retreat. It unraveled, thousands of coordinated bodies losing whatever silent communication bound them together the moment Marcus stepped fully into their midst. I remained at the observation deck's viewport long after my legs began to ache from standing, unable to look away from a sight that defied every briefing, every report, every careful assumption I had ever held about the limits of a single human body. The sensor feed struggled to keep pace with his movements. Where the swarm's advance had been slow and mechanical throughout the earlier hours of battle, methodical in a way that made resistance feel almost pointless, its retreat now carried the frantic, chaotic energy of a living thing that had suddenly remembered fear. Small vessels collided with one another in their haste to escape. Formations that had held disciplined shapes for hours, collapsing into scattered, fleeing fragments. Marcus moved among them without hesitation, though nothing in his movements suggested joy or triumph. Even through the imperfect clarity of the sensor feed, I could see something in the set of his shoulders that spoke of exhaustion far deeper than physical fatigue, a weariness that seemed to originate from somewhere beyond the body carrying it. Beside me, the elderly Sithari noblewoman who had spoken the old scriptural word continued murmuring quiet prayers under her breath, her trembling hands clasped together in a gesture I recognized from temple observances. Around the observation deck, similar reactions rippled through the gathered crowd, awe tangled inseparably with fear, as though everyone present understood they were witnessing something that belonged more to ancient religious texts than to the practical realities of modern warfare. I sought out Counselor Renar Ost again, finding him near a secondary display station, monitoring the battle's broader progress across multiple sensor arrays. His expression, when I approached, carried none of the professional composure he usually maintained. "Is this what the war priests feared?" I asked him directly. "Is this why they requested him specifically for this alliance?" Reynar's eyes remained fixed on the display before he finally answered. "The war priests did not fear him becoming this," he said quietly. "They feared what happens afterward, when the battle ends and the man underneath has to find his way back to being ordinary again." I did not fully understand his meaning until several hours later, when the battle finally reached its conclusion. The swarm's retreat, once begun, accelerated beyond anything the Sithari defensive formations could have achieved through conventional engagement. Entire sections of the choir's advancing force broke away from the border entirely, fleeing back toward whatever dark region of space had spawned them, abandoning territory they had fought to claim only hours before. Sithari formations that had been in full retreat themselves suddenly found themselves advancing unopposed, reclaiming ground that had seemed lost only a short time earlier. By the time the last remnants of the swarm vanished from the sensor arrays entirely, the outer settlement stood secure, their 12,000 civilians safely evacuated to protected zones, their homes battered but standing, their future no longer measured in hours but restored to something resembling ordinary time. The celebration that erupted across the command deck felt distant to me, muffled by my continued focus on the sensor feed still displaying the planet's surface below, where a single figure remained standing amid the wreckage of the battle, alone, motionless, as though uncertain how to proceed now that the immediate crisis had passed. I made a decision then that I suspect surprised everyone who witnessed it, myself included. I requested immediate transport to the planet's surface, ignoring the concerned protests of Counselor Renar and several other officials who insisted the area remained unstable, that proper protocols required waiting for confirmed all-clear signals before any non-combat personnel approached the battlefield. I did not wait for their permission. Some instinct, some understanding I could not fully articulate even to myself, told me that whatever Marcus needed in that moment, it was not further delay wrapped in careful protocol. The shuttle ride down felt endless, though the pilot assured me it lasted only minutes. I watched the planet's surface grow larger through the viewport, the scarred landscape below bearing the marks of a battle that had nearly claimed everything the outer settlements represented. When the shuttle finally landed near the coordinates where sensor feeds had last confirmed Marcus's position, I disembarked before the engines had fully powered down, ignoring the pilot's cautious warnings about remaining debris and unstable ground. I found him standing exactly where the feeds had shown him, amid the wreckage of the drop pod, surrounded by a landscape scarred with the marks of a swarm's chaotic retreat. From a distance, he appeared much as he had during the battle's final moments, though something in his posture had changed subtly, a slight stoop to his shoulders that had not been present during the height of the engagement. As I approached, he turned to face me, and the sight of him up close struck me with a force I had not anticipated. His eyes had returned to their ordinary warm brown, distant no longer, though exhaustion had carved deep shadows beneath them that made him look older than the years his human body should have carried. Whatever transformation had gripped him during the battle had receded entirely, leaving behind not a battle deity, not the entity the old scriptures had warned of, but simply a tired, ordinary man standing alone amid wreckage he had created in order to save lives that were never his to protect by any obligation beyond the one he had chosen for himself. "You should not have come down here," he said, his voice rough, quieter than I had ever heard it. "I needed to see you," I said. "Not what you become. You." Something in his expression shifted at those words, a flicker of surprise breaking through the exhaustion, as though he had expected a different reaction entirely, perhaps fear, perhaps the same wary distance the war priests always maintained around him. "Most people cannot separate the two," he admitted quietly. "After they have seen what I become, they struggle to remember there is still someone ordinary underneath it." I stepped closer, close enough to see the fine tremor in his hands, close enough to understand that whatever strength had allowed him to scatter thousands of coordinated enemies across a battlefield had cost him something significant in the aftermath. "I do not know everything about what happened to you at Cassandra Line," I said. "I do not fully understand what you become when the situation demands it, but I understand enough to know that the man standing before me right now, the one who looks this tired, this uncertain of how I might react, is not something to be feared." He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching mine as though verifying the sincerity behind my words. "The war priests have been afraid of me since the day I arrived in Dominion space," he finally said. "Not because of what I do during battles like this one, because they do not fully understand what keeps bringing me back afterward. They worry that eventually there will be a battle from which I do not fully return." I asked him what he meant, though some part of me suspected I already understood. "Each time it happens," he said, "it gets harder to remember which version of me is supposed to be permanent. The war priests watch me so closely because they are waiting for the day I forget how to become ordinary again." I thought of our wedding, of the careful, wary attention the war priests had shown him throughout the ceremony, attention I had misunderstood as suspicion toward humanity in general, rather than concern for one specific man carrying a burden few others could comprehend. "Then perhaps that is exactly why this marriage was arranged the way it was," I said slowly, understanding settling over me even as I spoke the words aloud. "Not simply to place someone loyal to my house close enough to observe you, but to give you a reason to keep finding your way back." He looked at me with an expression I could not fully name, something caught between disbelief and a fragile, uncertain hope. "I did not choose this marriage expecting anyone to understand that," he said quietly. "I did not expect anyone to look past what happened today and still choose to stand this close to me afterward." I reached out, taking his trembling hand in mine, the same hand that had been bound to my own by golden thread during a ceremony neither of us had chosen out of affection. "I did not marry you for duty because I believed you deserved nothing more than obligation," I said. "I am beginning to understand there may be far more to this marriage than either of us initially believed." Around us, the wreckage of the battle stretched in every direction, evidence of the overwhelming, almost incomprehensible power that had erupted from the quiet, apologetic man standing before me. Yet in that moment, none of that power felt as significant as the simple, fragile understanding passing between us, an understanding built not on the deity the old scriptures warned of, but on the exhausted, uncertain man who remained standing in its aftermath, waiting to see whether anyone would still choose to stay beside him once the battle's terrible glory had faded away. I did not yet know the full extent of what our marriage would eventually demand of both of us, or how completely the coming days would test whatever fragile understanding we had begun building amid the wreckage of that distant battlefield. I knew only that duty had brought us together, and that something entirely different, something neither of us had expected to find within an arranged, obligatory union, had begun quietly taking root in its place. The shuttle that eventually carried us back to Threnvos Station felt different from the one that had brought me down to the planet's surface. Marcus sat beside me throughout the journey, his exhaustion gradually easing as the adrenaline of the battle continued to fade, though something in the way he held himself remained different from the guarded, careful posture I had grown accustomed to during our early weeks of marriage. "You are still watching me differently than everyone else does," he observed quietly, partway through the journey. "I am watching the man who chose to become something terrifying in order to save people who were never obligated to matter to him," I said. "That seems worth watching closely, regardless of what form he takes when the situation demands it." He was quiet for a moment before responding, his voice carrying a warmth I had not heard from him since our wedding day. "Most people who learn what I truly am eventually decide the ordinary version underneath is not worth the trouble of looking for," he said. I considered his words carefully before answering, aware that whatever I said in this moment would shape the foundation of whatever our marriage might yet become. Then perhaps everyone who reached that conclusion before me simply was not looking closely enough, I said. The shuttle continued its journey back toward Threnvos Station, carrying us both toward whatever conversations, whatever revelations, whatever challenges still awaited in the aftermath of a battle that had revealed far more than either of us had been prepared to face. Yet for the first time since Golden Thread had bound us together in a ceremony built entirely on obligation, I found myself looking forward to whatever came next, rather than simply enduring it as duty demanded. The council chamber aboard Threnvos Station rarely convened in full session unless the matter under discussion carried consequences for the entire Dominion. 3 days after the battle for the outer settlements, I found myself standing outside its heavy doors, having been informed by a stiff, apologetic messenger that my presence had been requested to address what the summons vaguely called matters concerning the stability of my marriage. I entered to find a chamber far more crowded than I had anticipated. Beyond the usual council members, war priests occupied an entire section of seating along the chamber's eastern wall, their expressions carefully neutral in the way that Sithari religious authorities cultivated for public appearances. My mother sat among the noble observers, her posture rigid, though I caught a flicker of something protective in her eyes when our gazes met briefly across the chamber. Marcus stood near the center of the room, flanked by Colonel Ashworth and a Sithari legal advisor assigned to matters concerning the Alliance's human contingent. He looked composed, though the exhaustion from the battle still lingered faintly beneath his careful expression. The presiding counselor, an elderly Sithari statesman named Edric Voss, called the session to order with a formality that made my chest tighten with anticipation. "We convene today to address the continued stability of the union between Lady Velthara Kest Oram and Marcus Reyes," he began, his voice carrying easily across the chamber despite its age. "Recent events have raised questions regarding the original purpose of this marriage and whether that purpose remains adequately served under current circumstances." I understood immediately what lay beneath the careful, formal language. The marriage had been arranged, at least in part, to place someone loyal to my house close enough to observe Marcus, to serve as an early warning should whatever transformation he carried within him ever threaten to become uncontainable. That purpose, given the battle's outcome and my own subsequent actions afterward, had been compromised beyond repair. I had witnessed his transformation directly. I had chosen to approach him rather than retreat from him. In the eyes of whatever careful calculation had originally justified this union, I had failed in the role assigned to me. Matron Ishel Voss, the eldest of the war priests present, rose to address the council directly. I recognized her as the same priest who had questioned Colonel Ashworth's decision to deploy Marcus during the battle's earliest hours. The original arrangement served a specific purpose, she said, her voice measured and formal. To ensure that should the burden Marcus Reyes carries ever grow beyond his ability to manage it, someone trusted by this council would be positioned to recognize the signs and respond accordingly. Lady Velthara's actions following the recent battle suggest she has developed an attachment that may compromise her ability to fulfill that original purpose with appropriate objectivity. The words stung more than I expected, though I understood the logic behind them even as resentment rose within me. I requested permission to address the council directly, a request Councillor Voss granted with a small, measured nod. I stepped forward, aware of every eye in the chamber following my movement, aware that whatever I said in the coming moments would shape not only my own future, but Marcus's standing within an alliance that had never fully trusted him, despite depending entirely on what he could provide during moments of desperate need. "I did not develop an attachment that compromises my judgment," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I developed an understanding that this council apparently lacks. You speak of Marcus as though he is a weapon requiring careful containment, a danger to be monitored rather than a person deserving of basic dignity. 12,000 civilians on the outer settlements are alive today because of what he chose to become when no other option remained. That choice cost him something significant, a cost I witnessed firsthand in the aftermath of that battle. If this council's original purpose in arranging my marriage was to watch for signs of danger, then let me offer my observation plainly. The greater danger I witnessed was not Marcus losing himself to whatever power he carries. The greater danger was watching a man who saved thousands of lives stand alone afterward, uncertain whether anyone would still choose to approach him once the battle's necessity had passed." The chamber fell silent following my words, and for a moment I feared I had overstepped whatever careful boundaries governed such formal proceedings. Counselor Voss studied me for a long moment before turning his attention to Matron Ishel. "Does the war priesthood maintain concerns regarding Marcus Reyes's continued stability following the recent engagement?" he asked. Matron Ishel hesitated before answering, her eyes flickering briefly toward Marcus before returning to the council. "Our concerns have never centered on a single engagement," she said. "They center on the cumulative toll such transformations exact over time. Each instance makes the return to ordinary function more difficult. We do not know how many more times Marcus Reyes can undergo this process before the man underneath is lost entirely to whatever he becomes during battle." I felt Marcus tense beside me at these words, though his expression remained carefully composed. I understood, in that moment, that this fear, more than any concern about immediate danger to others, represented the true weight the war priests had been watching for since before our wedding, a fear not of what he might do to others, but of what the burden might eventually do to him. I addressed the council again, my voice steadier now, driven by an understanding that had crystallized fully during my journey back from the battlefield 3 days earlier. "Then perhaps this council has been asking the wrong question entirely," I said. "You have spent years arranging careful observation to detect the moment Marcus might become dangerous. Perhaps the more useful question is what might help ensure he continues finding his way back to himself, rather than simply watching for the moment he fails to do so." Counselor Voss regarded me with an expression I could not fully interpret, something between curiosity and cautious consideration. "What are you proposing, Lady Velthara?" he asked. I glanced toward Marcus before answering, finding in his expression a quiet, uncertain hope similar to what I had witnessed on the battlefield 3 days earlier. "I am proposing that this council recognize what I have already come to understand," I said, "that the bond between us has grown into something beyond the original political arrangement, and that this bond, rather than compromising whatever careful oversight this council originally intended, may in fact serve that same purpose more effectively than distant, wary observation ever could." The chamber murmured with quiet conversation following my declaration, council members exchanging glances, war priests conferring in low voices among themselves. Counselor Voss allowed the murmuring to continue for a long moment before raising a hand for silence. "This council will require time to consider such a proposal," he finally said. "In the meantime, the marriage between Lady Velthara Kestorum and Marcus Reyes will remain formally intact, pending further review." The session concluded shortly afterward, though the weight of what had been discussed lingered long after the chamber emptied. Marcus and I walked together back toward our quarters in silence, neither of us quite ready to address everything that had passed within that formal, careful chamber. It was only once we reached the privacy of our rooms that he finally spoke, his voice carrying a rawness I had not heard from him since our earliest conversations. "You did not have to defend me like that," he said quietly. "The council could have simply dissolved the arrangement, and you would have been free of whatever danger they believe I represent." I turned to face him fully, aware that whatever I said next would either confirm or contradict everything I had declared before the assembled council only hours earlier. "I did not defend you because duty demanded it," I said. "I defended you because I have come to understand something during these past weeks that I did not expect to find within an arranged marriage built entirely on political necessity." He studied me carefully, waiting for me to continue, and I found myself finally ready to voice the truth that had been building within me since I watched him standing exhausted and uncertain amid the wreckage of that distant battlefield. I asked him then, gently, about Cassandra Line, about what had truly happened during the incident that had reshaped his life so completely. This time he did not deflect the question. We were escorting a research team near the border when we encountered something none of our briefings had prepared us for. He began, his voice quiet, distant, as though recounting a memory he had spent years trying to keep buried. An experimental weapon, abandoned by whoever had built it long before either our people or yours arrived in this region of space. It activated when our team triggered proximity sensors we did not know existed. Most of my unit did not survive what happened next. I survived, but not entirely as the person I had been before. He explained, slowly, painfully, how the weapon's activation had rewritten something fundamental within his body, granting him capabilities that defied ordinary human physiology, capabilities that emerged fully only under extreme duress, when the need to protect others outweighed every instinct toward self-preservation. "I did not ask for this," he said. "I have spent 3 years trying to understand it, trying to control it, trying to ensure it remains a tool I use only when absolutely necessary, rather than something that defines who I am the rest of the time." "I understand now why the marriage was arranged this way," I said, "why the war priests watched so carefully, why you seemed almost embarrassed by the pageantry of our wedding, as though you did not believe you deserved the position you had been given." He nodded slowly. "I agreed to this marriage hoping, perhaps foolishly, that it might offer me something I had not experienced in 3 years," he admitted. "One relationship in my life that was not built entirely around what I am capable of doing to protect others. I did not expect to find it. I certainly did not expect to find it within an arrangement built purely on political necessity." I stepped closer, taking his hand in mine, the same gesture I had offered him amid the wreckage of the battlefield 3 days earlier. "You have found it," I said quietly, "not because duty demanded it, and not because the council has yet to decide what becomes of this arrangement. You have found it because I have chosen it, freely, with full understanding of everything you carry within you." His expression shifted, something fragile and hopeful breaking through the careful composure he had maintained throughout our conversation. "The council may yet decide to dissolve this marriage regardless of what either of us wants," he said. "Then we will face that decision together when it comes," I said. "But whatever the council decides regarding the formal arrangement, understand this clearly. My choice to remain beside you no longer has anything to do with the duty that first brought us together. I have seen what you become when the situation demands it, and I have seen the exhausted, uncertain man who remains once that terrible necessity has passed. I choose to stay for him, not for any political obligation this council might impose or remove." He was quiet for a long moment, studying my expression as though searching for any trace of uncertainty behind my words. Finding none, something in him seemed to finally, fully relax, a tension I had not fully recognized until I watched it ease from his shoulders. "I married you because duty demanded it," I said, echoing words I had spoken to myself during our very first night together as husband and wife. "I am choosing now, freely, to remain because I understand exactly what I would be leaving behind if I did not." 3 days later, the council reconvened to deliver its final decision regarding our marriage. I stood beside Marcus as Councillor Voss addressed the chamber, my hand steady in his despite the uncertainty of whatever verdict awaited us. "This council has considered the matter carefully," Councillor Voss began. "Given the demonstrated strength of the bond between Lady Velthara Kest Oram and Marcus Reyes, and given the war priesthood's assessment that such bonds may indeed serve as a more effective safeguard than distant observation alone, This council formally recognizes the continuation of this union, no longer as a political arrangement of convenience, but as a legitimate bond deserving the full protection and recognition afforded to any marriage within Dominion law. The chamber erupted into quiet murmurs of surprise and approval, though I heard little of it, my attention fixed entirely on Marcus beside me, on the quiet, disbelieving relief spreading across his features as the council's words settled fully into understanding. We walked from that chamber together, no longer bound by golden thread and political necessity alone, but by something we had both chosen freely, something built not on the deity the old scriptures had once warned of, but on the quiet, ordinary man who remained standing after every battle's terrible glory had finally faded away. I had wed him for duty. I remained, in the end, for everything duty had never promised me, and everything I discovered I wanted regardless.